Hi, and welcome back to the White Noise podcast. Today, we're going to be doing the second part of our true crime series. We're following on from our last episode, and this time we're going to be talking about true crime in fiction. This involves true crime in anything cinematic, really. So this is films, television, even parodies. And I think we have quite a lot to get through in this episode because me and Skye are both quite passionate about this. And I don't know, we enjoy it and we have a lot to laugh about, to be honest.
That's true. I mean, I think I said in the last one when we were kind of like alluding to this episode that this one was going to be more about how to portray maybe real life kind of situations like that in stuff. But then I realized we were going to be talking about shockingly wicked, extremely evil and vile. And I completely changed my mind because I only really have bad things to say about this film.
I mean, if you were looking for good, you'd be digging for a while.
Yeah. To anyone who somehow doesn't know, this film is based on the crimes of Ted Bundy. And I remember when it first got advertised, like instantly my brain was like, it's again raising that question of glorification of serial killers and their crimes. And I remember being so horrified by the trailer that came out, the original trailer, if anyone remembers seeing it, where it had like this really upbeat music and the scenes were all really cut in. Did you see it, Lyanna?
Yes, because I remember immediately it sparked debate about the casting of Zac Efron, which I still to this day find super uncomfortable. I don't know about you.
I think, do you know the thing is, and this bit makes me probably just as sad as the whole film, the fact that I know when he was probably got interested or got told, you know, there was interest around him because I think it was the director had wanted to work with him for a while.
Okay.
And originally, and this is why it's really interesting, so before the film even came out, people were obviously talking about that it was this whole idea of glorifying Ted Bundy and everything that he did. Zac Efron originally turned down the role because of that reason. He was worried that it was going to glorify Ted Bundy.
So you're such a good research assistant.
It was because I remember I watched Zac Efron's interview on the Ellen DeGeneres show, and he went on and on saying it wasn't a glorification and that he feared it was, but then he decided to get involved in the project because it wasn't. And I was like, because I hadn't seen the film yet, I was like, okay, you know what? If maybe it isn't. And then before I even saw it, got told that it was framed as a love story from the perspective of his girlfriend. And I was like, in what world is this not the most basic example of glorification? Like the whole thing was so uncomfortable to watch because he was okay, it's not like they lied and said he was a good guy or anything like that, but they showed her falling in love with him and they had like a meet cute and it was
and even though they're trying to frame it through her eyes, of course when you're framing through someone's eyes, you're positioning the audience to view someone a certain way, so like you're trying to endear him to the audience. And I don't care if they're saying, oh, you're not supposed to like him, but like say someone is completely unaware of what Ted Bundy did, in the beginning they're going to have certain views because they might like Zac Efron, and of course that's going to play into their perception of the character. And we also have to consider they cast Lily Collins. This is pre Emily in Paris, but she was already like a darling, wasn't she, amongst like you know, young women and like people interested in fashion and all that kind of area. And like just casting these young attractive people, it just made it seem like a fashionable thing. It seemed very like high genre, which I didn't understand because I saw this really interesting tweet the other day that said like, can we stop portraying Ted Bundy as this super charismatic man? Because when you consider the fact that when he lured people in, it wasn't necessarily with his charisma, it was through faking injuries. It doesn't really take
it was through the kindness from his victims. It wasn't
exactly. And people bring up his charisma when they talk about his like court trial, but it's like, did he really have to be charismatic? There's people who are super uncharismatic and women were infatuated with them when they saw them on TV.
Was he charismatic or was he just overly confident and cocky? Because that is the way he came across. And to be fair, okay, that is the way that Zac Efron portrayed him in the film. I wasn't saying that his portrayal was inaccurate. If anything, it was probably the opposite. And that's what also made it so uncomfortable. And I mean, something I noticed watching the film the second time around was that intentionally or not, it actually created this kind of sympathetic feel for Ted Bundy, not as in like it excused what he did and, you know, it was one of those films where it's like society turned him into a monster. It was to do with how they included, obviously, because the real trial was televised. So we know a lot of what happened in the court. You know, I could rant for a whole episode about the judge in that whole court case was ridiculous. But when Bundy's sentence, he says to him how it's such a shame and it's such a waste. He could have been such a good lawyer and he would have loved to have seen him practice in front of him. And it's like, you're actually made, because they focus so much on it in the film, you're made to feel sympathetic for the person he could have been. And I was just like, what?
It's so similar to the way that like people talk about young men that commit certain crimes on school campuses. That's come into light a lot in the recent years. They never talk about like the actual crimes or the victims. They talk about their potential, and it's just like shocking to see that in a film as well. Like, why do we need to see that? Can we stop like glorifying these people that did stuff in the past? Can we well, full stop, in my opinion, can we just stop making stuff about them? Like, there's a whole generation of people coming up that might never have heard of Ted Bundy if it wasn't for the fact that we keep bringing him up in new media. It's not that they're watching him from old films, they're watching Shockingly Evil, Extremely Wicked and Vile. They're watching all these true crime documentaries on Netflix. Like, can we just stop bringing him back? Like, let's just put it to rest. Like, let's respect the victims and let's stop not necessarily glorifying him, but just talking about him full stop.
That was another thing that I again didn't really, I think the first time I watched this film I made my decision pretty soon, early on, that I didn't like it. I didn't like the way they were portraying it, so I didn't pay much attention, remember much about it. But obviously this time watching it, because I knew we were going to be talking about it, I noticed that in the whole film, because it moves on, it doesn't really build a life for him, it builds his life alongside the crimes.
Yeah.
So it doesn't actually show any of the crimes up until right at the end, where they show one of them that is a shock because it obviously is very violent. And it just felt like it was done for the pure shock value. And then right at the end, obviously when it comes to true films that are based on true stories, they put up the text of what happened and everything and how many people he reportedly killed, and that they think it was more. And then they put the names of his known victims. And to me, it felt so cheap because the whole film completely erased the identities of his victims. And it was about him. The whole thing was about him. And then right at the end, when it put the names, I was like, you can't do that. You can't have a whole film that is about him and then put them being like, oh, but remember. It's like, throughout the whole film, you don't even think about it. Because like you said, for
such
people,
a cop-out, isn't it?
Yeah, for people who especially who maybe didn't know him going into this film, when you then put the names, yes, it is shocking because all of a sudden it's like having like cold water thrown on you. You're reminded that this was a real thing.
Yeah.
And it's horrible.
Like, I understand why they do that, but at the same time, that shouldn't be necessary. Like, stop bringing people up to not think about the victims. That shouldn't be such an impactful thing, you know, in the first place. It just shocks me how many things forget about victims. We didn't actually discuss this film when we were making notes, but Monster, starring Charlize Theron.
Yeah.
I don't know how we didn't think about that, but it's just suddenly come to my mind. That never thinks about the victims. Understandably, a lot of Eileen Wuornos's victims were men that attacked her. Completely understandable that it doesn't want to dive into them. I'm not entirely certain, so like maybe a listener will correct me. Maybe one or two of her victims weren't attackers. I'm not sure, which kind of shows how she has been portrayed. Her crimes, both in like documentaries and in Munster, are shown to be entirely justified because of the way she was treated by society. And it's you know, like maybe there are some victims that shouldn't be humanized and remembered, but that doesn't mean that you should then try to make a serial killer redeemable. You know, it's just disgusting.
This is something we did briefly discuss in the previous episode about true crime documentaries, and why we wanted to also do this episode is because There is the difference between films that are based, or I hate using the word inspired, but based loosely on certain serial killers and crimes that happened, and then films like Monster or Shockingly Wicked that are actually about them. Like, there is the big difference, and that's when that's when the split between these true crime documentaries and the film comes in. It's like the true crime documentaries, we spoke about it, people have an interest in it, and having the interest isn't the issue. But that's when the true crime documentary needs to come in, and it needs to portray it, one, accurately, but also without the showboating, without the Hollywood and the flashing lights and the music. It just needs to be the information that it's meant to be. And then you have your films that are pure fiction, even if they're based on loosely on the events, but they are still fiction, because you get people will probably say to us about Shockingly Wicked that, oh, but it was just a film. That's the issue. It wasn't just a film. And I think that's why this is the one I have the most issue with.
We can't not have these shows and these films. They're gonna happen, but I think that maybe some creators could have a bit more tact. But it's, I know we talked about this in the last episode, like you say, there's going to be a lot of back and forth here. It's also up to audiences to stop wanting these portrayals of serial killers. Like, stop asking for these films that like redeem them. Like, why do you want that? Just understand they're a serial killer. Like, maybe you want to understand them, read about them. Don't watch these films that make them out to be people too. Like, it's like we're all bad for it. I mean, like, we've both seen the Zac Efron film. I've seen Monster. Have you watched Monster?
I have.
Exactly. Like, we're just as bad as the people we're talking about. But I mean, like, going forward, I think I am going to try and make an active effort to not consume these films, because like, anytime you even think about sitting and watching this film, like, maybe think about the victim instead. Like, before we started recording this episode, before we started recording the last episode, we had a conversation about how we think adaptations of crimes and like allusions to real life serial killers might be a way forward. It's not a perfect solution, but it's maybe more suitable than constantly putting out films introducing new audiences to these killers. And we mentioned films such as, like the classics like Psycho and Silence of the Lambs and Texas Chainsaw. And I don't know, I personally think that might work better, but what do you think?
Well, but you know what I realized as well? It's always the same serial killers. It's always Ted Bundy. It's always Ed Gein. It's always Jeffrey Dahmer. Like, I'm not saying that this isn't my point, we should broaden out and choose more, but just the ones that you mentioned there, like Psycho, Silence of the Lambs, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, were all notoriously linked to or inspired by Ed Gein. He's like in all of them. And I think that, I mean, there is just something about watching something like Shockingly Wicked that it's just so uncomfortable, because it was a real thing. But then you have something like Silence of the Lambs that, in all honesty, unless you knew, would you be able to say that it was inspired by these specific people? And is that, in its sense, if it has to be done, not better?
See, this is exactly my point. Like, it isn't introducing people to these real life characters, but then on the other hand, it is still showing them these atrocious acts because it's showing them a fictional character. But I think my main takeaway is the fact that people could be maybe, people, there are copycats. People could be introduced to such acts and copy them from fictional characters, but they're not gonna find out about these real killers and research the level of fame that they achieved, and then maybe
the
want to
notoriety.
replicate. Exactly. So, like, obviously it's not a solution, but I think maybe instead of trying to give people how would I explain it,
A
people
platform.
like, people are always going to want to see violence on screen. and like fucked up acts, because like we're human beings. Maybe instead of like constantly portraying real people, we could just come up with things, which in itself sounds really fucked up now I say it out loud. Like, let's just write them and come up with these things.
Yeah, I understand what you're trying to say though. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned about, obviously, one of the dangers about portraying real life people that I think a lot of people don't think about, because a lot of the time the people watching or consuming this media are, like, I would say us, I would like to think, that are not watching it and thinking, oh, this is cool, I want to be this person. But unfortunately, you will get people like that think, you know, if you portray someone in a sympathetic light, or in a light where it makes them out to be this kind of celebrity, even though they know the things they are doing are bad, they will still get the notoriety from it. And I remember when there was, I know, Lyanna, you haven't seen it, but there was an ITV series called Des that had David Tennant portraying, again, another notorious serial killer. And the whole thing in that is that he wanted the notoriety for it. And there was like this final scene in the series where there was an author writing a book on him, and I can't remember what he ended up calling the book, but the guy wanted it to be called Des or whatever after him. And he said, I'm not doing that because I didn't write this for you, I wrote it for the victims. But then they made a TV series that they named after him. And it was just so weird, because it was like they were making a point and then they were missing the point that they were making.
They're just so leaning into it at that point. Like, look at the film My Friend Dharma. Like, it's literally called My Friend Dharma. Like, how could they not look at the title of that and think, how fucked up is this? Like, what's wrong with people? Look at the film Zodiac. It's literally named Zodiac. That is a fucking banging film. Like, I will not lie, Fincher went off. But, you know, like, he would have loved that. He was obsessed with the media coverage. Like, they live for it. That is like a huge aspect of why these serial killers do what they do, you know? Like, of course, there's the thrill of it, but then, like you say, notoriety is such a huge aspect. Like, you are completely doing what they want when you give them a visual platform, you know? And like, I can't help but watch lots of the media pushed out in recent years and think, like, you're fucked up for doing this, because you're feeding into this bizarre fascination, you're desensitizing people, which is a whole argument in and of itself, and you're giving them what they want. A huge thing that you and me just really do want to dive into is, of course, the behemoth, which is Ryan Murphy's career. I could say American Horror Story, but it's not. It's Ryan Murphy's
Do you know,
career.
I said that before we started this, that I said, oh, obviously we need to talk about American Horror Story. Then Lyanna was just like, no, we need to talk about Ryan Murphy.
Yes.
But it's true. And I mean, American Horror Story is obviously the one that sticks out. And I do remember, again, watching it when it first came out. And like, one of the episodes that really sticks out for me in the first season is the Black Dahlia one. And the reason I did initially find it interesting is because obviously the Black Dahlia was an unsolved case, and then they wrote it as if it did have this story. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then obviously as I got older, and I was kind of like, this is a thing that happened. And then, and again, another one of the most notorious ones is in Hotel, where you have, that's the Halloween episode, I think it was, where all the serial killers come to the hotel. And again, it's just exactly what you said. If this is somebody's introduction into these people, it makes them out to be, again, not good people, but people with these high statuses and celebrity statuses and notorious in history and being so good at being bad.
But they get to be featured in a TV show decades after they committed their crimes.
Yeah.
Do you know what's funny to me? Is it's primarily like teenagers and young adults that eat that shit up. But it's
which at one point,
middle-aged
you know,
men writing it.
Yeah. I mean, at one point we were these teenagers and young adults. Like, we admitted fully in the last episode that these are kind of ways of thinking that we've had to unlearn as we've grown older.
Yeah.
And this is why we wanted to talk about it here. And obviously people are going to have different opinions. This is one of those cases where, of course, you're entitled to your own opinion. But it just...
There is a wrong one. I don't want to, you know, straight up say there's a binary and it's black and white. But I'm just gonna be completely frank right now, and say you can You can act like these things are fun and just enjoy them
And
and
like
act
they're okay. Yeah.
exactly like,
Mhm.
okay, fine, if you enjoyed the show, that's totally chill. But if you're, oh my God, I loved that Halloween scene with all the serial killers, like maybe you need to sit down and think about why you
Yeah.
enjoyed that so much and why you were like, posting it all over Tumblr.
hmm
But,
I
you know,
mean, a really good film that actually is about everything that we're talking about is Nightcrawler.
mm,
That film is literally about people's obsession with the macabre and their desensitization to it. Like, the director of this film actually created it because he wanted to do a commentary on the news media in general and how it becomes so desensitized that you're literally getting these people shoving cameras in victims' faces when these gruesome, life-shattering events have just happened. But he also wanted it to be like pointing the finger at the audience and being like, why do you consume this?
exactly, because it's not just the news media we consume, you're consuming that film itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know about you, but that film was fucking incredible to me.
Yeah.
Like,
Even
I
more so, I think, rewatching it now, because like when I first
yes.
watched it, I didn't fully understand it. And like I kind of missed a lot of what was happening. But then watching it again, especially in the context of what we wanted to speak about now, I was like, whoa, it really does make you think.
Yes, because looking it up just this second, we were about 16 when that film came out. So as
Wow.
much as we could enjoy it, it takes on such a different meaning now. So like at 16, I imagine you did too. We both already had an active interest in like serial killers and like crime history. We were both
hmm
already into horror films, which I think lended itself to that other interest.
hmm
And Nightcrawler actually did make me go aside and look into research into news media and true crime
hmm
coverage. Like I was so mind blown by what I saw in that film. I was like, there's no way.
That's
And
exactly what I was like. And then I was like,
exactly. And
whoa.
yeah, holy fuck, this is real. Like,
Yeah.
that film is just incredible. Like, I highly recommend it to so many people. Like,
hmm
Jake Gyllenhaal is just insane in that
Yeah.
film. He
Yeah.
deserved every award, to be honest.
Which he didn't get. Just
Which is
quickly to throw that
insane. A
out there.
very
Yeah.
underrated film of 2014.
Snubbed. Yeah.
Yes, a big snub.
hmm
Um, yeah, it's such a good film for portraying how like the media and the audience have this like symbiotic relationship with each other and
hmm
how they just feed into each other and one couldn't exist without the other. And it's that's kind of what me and Sky have been trying to get at in this episode and the last, is that like you can't just blame one, you have to blame
Yeah.
both. You kind of have to get rid of this entire culture and atmosphere and environment. um I don't know how. I do think a big bit, like we said in the last episode, is Netflix chilling a bit. Films like Nightcrawler, they actually help because they're not about a specific serial killer. They're like examining the entire system of like why we're
hmm
interested in these things. So maybe if you're interested in like media coverage of true crime and true crime itself, maybe try and lean into things like Nightcrawler instead of like mindlessly consuming not American Psycho, American Horror Story. But I do think we should bring up American Psycho maybe in a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah. This isn't to like judge anyone. Like Sky said a minute ago, we both
hmm
consumed this stuff a lot, but I think it's just reaching that point where you realize that maybe there is something problematic about this consumption. Not just me, but like everyone consuming this and the people making it.
I mean,
Yeah.
it does like these past two episodes have very much felt like stepping on eggshells because I don't want to make anybody feel bad for
Yeah, me
consuming
too.
these kind of things because like I said, we've held our hands up. We've all done it. We've had to do it for this episode. And we've argued that maybe doing this episode is contributing in a way we don't want to. But it's just kind of like it's less about being like, no, bad, and more being kind of like just wanting people to become more active audiences as opposed to passive.
Yes, and that's why I love like work like parodies, which we
Mm-hmm.
will dive into in a sec. And I just said about American Psycho a second ago, which is another thing I'd never even thought about bringing up.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of specific real life people that mentions or alludes to, but Bret Easton Ellis, who wrote the original novel, his entire work is about like dissecting horrific acts in our real world, and like certain cultures, like particularly the yuppies of the 80s, which is like what American Psycho and Less Than Zero focus on. Yeah, Bret Easton Ellis's work, it just kind of dives into like, we shouldn't glorify these people. They did a lot of bad things, and it challenges you to like look at their surface level self and not just assume that they're good people because they're rich and good looking, like to see the terrible things they do. And what is fascinating to me is the amount of people that watch American Psycho and do not get that message.
But that's just it. And I think this is why, we're trying more to go from the passive to the active, is because, yeah, there are people watching this who will probably watch it and still be like, oh no, this is horrible, don't like it, but still kind of won't think about why. Like, is it just because you don't like gory serial killer stuff? That's fair enough. Or is it because it's a bit too close to the line? Like, there is a line that you don't have to cross to still make a good horror film. And sometimes, like, there are those films that cross the line, and or TV shows that cross the line, and it's just so uncomfortable for the wrong reasons, if that makes sense.
Yes, I completely agree, because some things cross the line just to cross the line. Like, I always think of Lars von Trier's films. Have you ever watched any?
No. Or at least I don't think so.
I imagine you've heard of them, like Antichrist, The
Oh
House
yeah,
That
films.
Jack Built,
I
Nymphomaniac.
like list of films that I probably will never watch because
Yes.
I know the context of
There's
them.
have you ever seen the Iceberg list?
Oh, the ones about, I
Disturbing
did,
films.
because I was so shocked when I looked at the bottom of it and things I'd never even heard of, and all these films I won't watch were like the tip. I was like,
Yes.
what the hell?
What I think is quite interesting is when we're talking about some of the films we're talking about today, it's very easy to slip down that rabbit hole. So like we're saying, it's like being an active versus a passive audience. When you say watch American Psycho, oh, maybe next you'll watch Texas Chainsaw. Maybe next you'll watch, let me think of an example. What's worse than Texas Chainsaw? Maybe you'll watch like Antichrist. Maybe then you'll watch this or that. Maybe you'll eventually get to like Tetsuo the Iron Man and Necromantic, and you'll just get lower and lower and get creepier and creepier. Maybe you'll get to like Salo, like 120 Days of Sodom. Like, you'll get real weird and depraved with it, which I would not recommend. That film is horrific, but like it's very easy to slip down that, because you're kind of almost waiting to see what the next most fucked up thing is.
I think that's it. It's like when we talk about how desensitization works, that it gets to a point where you've seen all this stuff and it's like you're no longer affected by it. So yeah, you're right, you keep going down that rabbit hole of things that, like, you're looking for something that will make you uncomfortable. And I mean, I'm not one of those,
fix, isn't it?
yeah, I mean, I'm not one of those people that watches films to be uncomfortable. Like, I have watched uncomfortable films, but I don't enjoy being made, like, I like films that scare me, like the whole adrenaline side of it. I don't like films that make me uncomfortable. I know some people do. That's fair enough. But I don't know. So I can't imagine, dude, like, even just thinking about those kind of films freaks me out too much to even entertain the idea of watching them.
I know, like, I think the worst film I watched was maybe the third level on that iceberg. Maybe max. And that was too much for me, like way too much. Like,
I didn't even get below the water.
There you go. And like, I just don't understand how people can think it's okay to keep diving deeper and deeper, and that's what these films do. They, like, as much as I want to believe they don't actively encourage it, they kind of do. And although we did talk about something like American Psycho, I do want to address that film does not actively try to do that. Mary Harron, who directed the film, she is an active feminist. Like, I would consider American Psycho in some ways, well, in many ways, a very feminist film. Like, I mean, it was co-wrote by two women and directed by a woman. It's definitely aware of women as victims, but its audience kind of fucked up in a lot of ways. And I think that can happen with a lot of films. And I think that's what a lot of creators need to understand when they make these films, is that it's not necessarily the people that they think are going to watch it that end up watching it. Sometimes you're going to end up with the wrong audience, so you have to have some responsibility.
I mean, the thing is, as well, is that unfortunately, you don't have control over the audience that consumes your media. But this is why I think straying away from actively portraying real life people will in part begin to change that kind of culture, because stuff like American Psycho and anything like that that's like, yeah, because of the content of it, you will attract the wrong audience. But the difference is, like I said, this person wasn't real. The acts are still horrific, but this person wasn't a real person. You're not glorifying a real person. Whereas, again, just to go back to it, I mean, it's definitely not the worst offender. It's just the worst one I have on my list. Was shockingly wicked. And I mean, things like My Friend Dharma and all things like that portray real people, it's almost kind of like excusing what they do, because they never portray them in a way that you don't sympathize or you don't get some kind of understanding, because you get their backstory. I mean, one of the things about Nightcrawler that's also so good is that when you watch it, and like you watch it as an active audience, or you might even notice it anyway, but you never get Lou, the main character's backstory. You meet him in the beginning of the film when he gets stopped by a cop and he beats the cop up and steals his watch, right? You meet him when he is stealing copper to sell to people. He's portrayed as somebody who is selfish, will only do what he wants, and will do whatever he wants to be able to get what he wants. Because they didn't want to portray him as a sympathetic character, because they knew the audience would sympathize with him if he had some kind of horrific backstory. And I thought that was so interesting, because it was an active decision that was made, because the whole point of the film wasn't his character. He was just the narrator through which the story was being told. And I think it has one of like the best final scenes in any film, when you see the two vans drive off, and it's that whole thing of, kind of like these films do, are now spreading this virus through the city of what he's been doing. He's sending more people out to disrupt these crimes and to just...
I love that the ending of Nightcrawler. I mean, like, obviously spoiler warnings as usual, but the ending of Nightcrawler is like, it's not necessarily about like glorifying, it's about consequence.
Mm-hmm.
Which I absolutely adore, because like you can view that film in different ways. OMG, so intense, so cool. Or you can view it as, holy fuck, this is so bad. And I'd hope most people would see it the second way. But like you say, you have no control over your audience. So sometimes some people might, and you take that, like, view it the other way, and you take that risk when you make media about these kind of topics. And I don't know, you see copycat killers in the past, quite often, which is actually quite upsetting, but quite often as well, they're usually after real cases, not after fictional cases. Because as much as I think people are influenced by real life cases, they're influenced by real life people more, because they've seen the heights that a real life person can reach in media without being an already existing piece of media. Does that make any sense? So like, it's not a film character, it's a real person that managed to reach that level of fame.
As soon as you put that based on a true story stamp on anything, there is this intimate connection just instantly, no matter what it's about, because it's a real thing that happened. Whereas stuff that's loosely based or not based at all, and it's just completely conjured, almost is kind of consumed and then can be moved on from, right? Yes. But when you portray this person, you consume this media, and then you go deep diving. You go onto the internet, you learn more about them, things that maybe they purposely kept out of the film because it was too much. It doesn't mean it was erased from history. It's still there for people to find. And you're kind of like opening the gate for people to go and do this. And again, for some people, it's just an innocent, it's general curiosity that everybody has about things like this. But like Lyanna said, unfortunately, every so often you will have somebody that will just identify a bit too much with this person.
Which is why I think it's so interesting that some of the most successful, I think that's why I think sometimes, like we said earlier in the episode, it can be more wise to do fictional portrayals when you want to talk about these acts. And we briefly touched on like things like Psycho and such in the past, but I think we also need to touch on things like maybe like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We mentioned we definitely wanted to cover these. I just briefly want to say, like, films like these kind of touch onto like public fears at the time of their release, or maybe just like a decade prior. You can pick up on a lot of public fear through horror films, particularly like things that have happened in true crime. And I think what's interesting is that a lot of these horror films almost like reinforce those fears. So films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they showed that like horrific things can happen in daylight. you know. I don't know if this is naive to assume, but I don't think Texas Chainsaw Massacre like encouraged people to go out with a chainsaw. You know, it was based on like Ed Gein, you know, and like oh, it sounds horrible to put it this way, but like bodily mutilation and those kind of like subjects. I don't think people went out of their way. I think, if anything, people were more horrified. Whereas if there was a film made about Ed Gein and sympathised with him, it showed all the bodily mutilation and his fucked up relationship with his mum, people might sympathize with him more. But instead, it feels like those different aspects of him were detached. So, like, you get the parts of him that are more like bodily mutilation and such talked about in Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Silence of the Lambs, but then you get the more personal sides of him talked about in something like Psycho, which feels really interesting because almost to pack them all into one, you're talking about him himself and then you're exploring him as a person.
But again, it's so less harmful than, like you said, if you put it all into one film with his name labeled to it. Because I mean, I will admit, I don't think I've watched all of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because I actually think the original was worse than the remakes that they did. I think they're a lot more graphic. So I don't think I've actually been able, I don't think I've been able to watch them. So I don't know if it's one of the ones that does. But again, it goes back to that whole idea that as soon as you kind of say inspired by true events or based on whatever, people will go deep diving to look. But things like Psycho, which it's really interesting that you bring up about the whole sympathetic side of it, because I watched it today to refresh my memory, and my girlfriend watched it with me and she'd never seen it before, but she had seen Bates Motel. And obviously she already had like she actually had a sympathy for his mother, which is something you don't get in the original film, because obviously that's what the series focuses on, you know, their relationship and why she is the way she is and why he is the way he is. And I just thought it was so interesting that it's a sympathy you don't even have until you've consumed this other media that goes further with it. But she's having sympathy for a fictional character. This wasn't a real person, inspired by true events or not, you know. So it's understandable to have that kind of, because it's made to feel sympathetic. Whereas again, when you have the real person, and the sympathy that you feel is kind of, it's so uncomfortable the way that they make you feel it, because you know this person did horrible things to real people. It's just not good.
You dived in. I love it. No, I agree. Like, it can be detrimental to people when they're encouraged to like sympathize with real life people over fictional, like for all the reasons we've been saying throughout this episode. And like you say, like your girlfriend, she sympathized with a, you know, a fictional character. So like it's someone involved in these horrific events without actually sympathizing with someone who committed really bad deeds in real life. Like, it's more understandable. It practices sympathy and understanding without doing it to a real fucked up person and then like demeaning real life victims.
I mean, one, actually, I don't, it's just coming to my mind now, but one piece of media we didn't even think about talking about was You, the Netflix series You, because it just came because I realized that, again, it was another series that I watching it with the same perspective I have now, and I was kind of like, I know they were trying to make this person charismatic or whatever, but my girlfriend said she was watching it, she liked Joe as a character, you know, like she didn't like what he was doing, but she was being led into this whole charismatic side of it, and she wasn't the only one. A lot of people did. They do portray him as a funny, quirky character that you're meant to like.
I'm not like other boys.
He's he's the protagonist, antagonist. I don't know what the in-between word for it would be, because he is both. But again, that's another one that it's not based on somebody real. Okay, so I'm not mad at my girlfriend for liking this character. I tease her about it because I'm kind of like, I hope you're joking, but it's like, he wasn't a real person, you know. Whereas if then you found out he was based on this real guy, all of a sudden it's kind of like, ooh, I'm good.
Exactly. I think with that note, we should maybe lean into the final aspect of this episode, because we've been talking for a while. We've not even started. We did mention.
Also, I think we've gotten a bit dark, so just something to slightly lighten the mood.
Yeah, let's lighten it up and pivot to parodies, which we mentioned at the beginning. What do you want to start with, Skye?
Well, one of the ones we talked about in the last episode was obviously American Vandal, which I think
Iconic.
Lyanna should lean into a bit more because I know she had more she wanted to say about it.
Oh, mate, understatement century. I'm obsessed.
I fully promised I was gonna finish watching it for this episode. Out of everything we were doing, completely slipped my mind. I do definitely still want to watch it, but yeah, I know Leanna's like I can see her itching to get to get it out.
So I recommend American Vandal to basically anyone with eyes and ears because it's so fucking good at so many different things. It's so good at like parodying Netflix's own method and formula, which is hilarious because it's a Netflix original, and it gets very meta about this. Season two, which dives into a new case entirely from this first season, basically suggests that the boys who are fictional characters from the first season who made the show were picked up by Netflix and they expanded their budget and now they're doing a second
Which
season.
would happen, let's be honest.
Exactly.
It
And
would
it's
happen.
genius. And it's like it talks about true crime and not like murder. Like it's silly stuff. In the first season, it's who spray painted dicks on the cars of the teachers. And in the second season, it's about the brownout, which is when someone spiked the lemonade, so everyone in the school shat their pants. And it's like
Amazing.
it's
Extremely
I
highbrow
know,
humor. We love
and
it.
it's so funny because it like manages to parody Netflix's formula whilst also being a truly engaging show and capturing teenagers like I've never seen in anything. And this is what I said to Skye when I tried to get her into the show was like it gets teens and like teens and young adults are the people watching a lot of true crime. So it's just like it's this perfect show and it doesn't take itself too seriously like a lot of other true crime does, and I love it. And like just out of every crime parody that is, it's my favorite. And it's the one I would suggest because like it's taking the piss out of true crime without talking about actual true crime events.
I think you need these kind of parodies to balance it out, to kind of like, if you don't realize it whilst you're watching it, that maybe this is a little bit effed up. Watching these parodies, I think, brings to light kind of like Nightcrawler does, but in a more humorous and lighthearted way. It really makes you realize how ridiculous they can be and
Yes.
how far they go.
It challenges you to see that like maybe you're not actually caring about the crime and the victims itself. You're just caring about like how good the editing is
Yeah, exactly.
and the pacing.
I mean, let's say you take away all the big fancy editing, and are you still interested?
Exactly.
Because if you're not, you're watching it for the wrong reasons.
And I love it. Like, we talked about a few other parodies, such as the Ass Crack Bandit from Community.
Which the more I think about it, is like it's done for pure comedy. It's not meant to be a commentary on like actual true crime documentaries. But again, it's just the ridiculousness of it all.
Which is great because we looked it up and that would have come around in about 2010 in season two. And this is like preceding the era of like Netflix true crime. But obviously true crime's already a thing. Like you're already getting all these like documentary channels talking about true crime. And it's like NCIS and like this like insane, editing. But at that point it was funny. No one actually took it seriously and like consumed this shit like crazy yet. It had
I also just want to point out just quickly that we were talking about from the show Community, because I just realized the phrase the ass crack bandit to anybody who hasn't seen Community. Very strange. Sounds like possibly a real thing. Possibly. But yeah.
Yeah, that's another show I highly recommend, which parodies a lot of stuff quite well. Challenges a lot of things. There's just so many parodies we can talk about. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia did an episode in a recent season called Making Dennis Reynolds a Murderer. Fucking brilliant. Obviously referencing Making a Murderer by Netflix. It does it just so well. Like, and it was quite soon after that show went crazy. Like, I mean, we addressed in the previous episode, I think, that was the show that made like true crime a thing again, especially in like Netflix terms. Making Dennis Reynolds a Murderer, it takes all the format. It uses the editing. It uses like the sudden cut to black and white. It's just brilliant because there's this long running theory throughout It's Always Sunny that one of the main characters is a murderer. So like, what better way to kind of lean into that theory than to parody true crime? Like, that show never takes anything seriously. So to get a bit meta with it was just like, it's just insane. And like, I don't know, anything that parodies like a real world formula is perfect to me. And seeing as true crime has just gotten so ridiculous recently, I want to see more of it. It feels like true crime parodies were a thing in 2016, 2017. I want them again because like American Vandal got cancelled, which is so sad. We only got
Horrible.
2 seasons. Making Dennis Reynolds a Murderer was one episode. Kimmy Schmidt, I mentioned, there's an episode which parodies, but they were all like 4 years ago now.
We need to bring back, yeah. So this is actually a PSA of just bringing back parodies of true crime dramas because I think we need them.
Yeah, to like alleviate like the
Yeah,
seriousness.
to really balance it out.
This isn't to say like the crimes itself themselves aren't serious. It's just like to make people get over them almost. You know, like to get out their own bubble of true crime. Like it feels like every time I go on Netflix now on a Friday, there's a new true crime documentary. Like maybe we just need to make them chill the fuck out.
It is the thing. And I mean, I just feel like, especially with the way the world is at the moment, I don't think true crime documentaries are what we need more of. I think it's the parodies and the humor and the comedy, that kind of escapism. You know, I don't want to escape from one tragic historic event into another, really.
Yeah, exactly. Like right now, do we really need to be learning more about true crime when we're going through a fucking pandemic? Like, I know it's getting a bit dark with it, but it's not what we need.
I mean, it's even getting to a point where like it's spreading into all forms, like TikTok, for example, and you've got those really dark POVs of people pretending to be like your serial killer boyfriend, and it's just like,
it's just continuation of Tumblr culture, isn't it? And I think
Yeah.
it's all, which itself was fed by American Horror Story. Like this stuff has gone on for decades. Like true crime has always been a fascination. And like I think like you acknowledged, like doing this episode hasn't really helped. But at the same time, we want to discuss this. And to be honest, we've been talking about it for a while, so we should probably wrap up this episode soon. But like,
I mean, I think we've said over these past 2 episodes everything that we can.
I could talk forever, but you've got to keep it concise, otherwise you'll just keep repeating yourself.
I mean, it's an interesting topic, and it's one that I would genuinely like to hear other people's opinions on. And, you know, just like, do you consume this kind of media? Do you not? Why do you? Why don't you? What changes do you want to see? Do you not think it should change? And kind of why you think it shouldn't? Or yeah, just ways that we can make it better, I guess. If this is gonna be a thing, you know, not just a passing fad, but this is going to be a thing now that true crime is going to be its own genre in the sense it has become, then maybe we just need to reevaluate exactly how we're approaching these really sensitive topics,
consuming it and creating it.
Yeah, and just find that line and not step over it. I think it's the best way to think about it.
I think it's all about staying respectful to the real life people involved, which of course is not really something that's happening right now. If anyone has any recommendations for parodies or genuinely respectful and interesting true crime stuff, I'd love to hear about them. I think I'm going to be sharing some on our social media. So if you follow us and keep an eye, I'll be sharing some of our favorite parodies because they are just a perfect antidote right now. You get that like true crime formula fix, which you might enjoy without like feeling like a dickhead.
Yeah, pretty much.
So yeah, keep an eye out for them.
And we're still so bad at ending episodes.
No, we got to have the classic fade out. But yeah, I think that's it for today.
Yeah, pretty much. Leave your comments on YouTube, the Twitters, even the Instagrams. We have an Instagram for anybody that's interested. We finally have one.
This is like the first episode we're probably plugging our social media.
Yeah, I've just realized. But it's there. Like, you know, if you want to rant at us, tell us how completely wrong we are, or how, you know, maybe this is something you've been thinking about and feeling for a while, but you just kind of didn't know where you could share this without people kind of jumping down your throats. It's here.
Exactly. We love some constructive criticism.
Yeah. So have a good night. Go watch American Vandal, and we'll see you in the next one.
Yeah, watch American Vandal. We'll start a hashtag. Bring back American Vandal.
Just
the Snyder Boys, we can do it. We can do it.
Ooh.
But yeah, that's it for me.